They later said the story had been told 100 different ways, salted, exaggerated, dressed in fog and folklore, until it barely resembled anything that could have happened under a real sky. But the version that mattered wasn't the embellished one. It was the first one. The one printed in 1907 in a Sunday newspaper, laid out with the blunt confidence of ink that wants to be believed. The writer insisted this wasn't a campfire tale, not a sailor's drunk invention. This, he said, was what had happened recently in modern waters aboard a Russian steamer that ended up abandoned off the California coast. That insistence is part of what makes it hard to shake. Because even when a story is wrong, it can still be true in the way fear is true. How it moves through a room, how it makes strangers act in chorus, how it reduces a life to a single reflex. The printed account didn't rely on chains rattling in the hold or pale hands tapping on portholes. It relied on something smaller, a change in the air. And then everything human fell apart. One evening in the middle of March of 1907, a sailor named Nels Nelson stood at the bow of a big Russian steamboat called the Parrier. He faced the Pacific with his hands braced on the rail, shoulders tight beneath his coat, eyes fixed on the darkening line where the ocean met the last smear of day. The sun was sinking. The light had thinned to a weak copper wash, as if the world were being drained. On the surface, the ship moved smoothly, a steady vibration underfoot, the engine's pulse as familiar as breathing. But Nell's face didn't match the calm of the sea. He looked like a man waiting for something he already knew would come. A month earlier, the Parrier had left Hong Kong with a cargo of hemp and machinery, bound for California. The journey so far had been quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. The kind of quiet sailors didn't trust. And that day, the Parrier had passed Honolulu, which meant they were nearly at their final destination. Near enough that the mind begins to count the days by instinct. Near enough that a man who has been holding his breath for weeks starts to wonder if he can exhale. On the bow, as the temperature dropped and the first edge of night crept in, Nels couldn't stop thinking about what the darkness might bring. It wasn't the usual maritime caution, storms, rogue waves, engine trouble. He lived long enough with the sea to accept those as part of the job. This was different. This was a dread that didn't have weather attached to it. A dread that belonged to the ship itself. Nels had been a sailor his whole life. He was originally from Sweden, born in a place where winter teaches you patience and the sea teaches you humility. He'd traveled widely, learned the small languages of ports, and the bigger language of survival. A few years back, he'd linked up with the Parrier in Hong Kong, and by now, aside from the captain, he was the longest-serving man aboard, which meant something he did not want it to mean. It meant that Nels and the captain were the only two men currently aboard who knew the ship's dark secret. They hadn't told anyone. They didn't intend to. It wasn't a plotted deception. It was more like a shared superstition, a private vow made without words. We don't speak of it. Not because we're hiding it, because speaking of it makes it closer. At the last port in Hong Kong, the ship had been docked long enough for the truth to seep into the crew the way rumors seep into any confined place. And when the moment came to sail, the entire crew, every man except Nels and the captain, had deserted. Not in a dramatic mutiny. No pistols, no shouted demands, just absence. One man gone from his bunk, then two, then a handful. The kind of desertion that happens when fear is unanimous, when even the boldest mouth in the mess hall goes quiet and starts packing. By the end of it, only Nels and the captain remained, standing on a ship that suddenly felt too large, too empty, too too aware. They had to replace the crew. They needed hands to sail to California, to offload hemp and machinery, to do the ordinary work of commerce that keeps the world moving. So they did what desperate men do. They recruited quickly, pulling in a ragtag bunch of sailors, anyone with a pulse, anyone willing to sign on. As a result, the crew they ultimately assembled was the kind of crew that made a careful man uneasy, even on a normal ship. A sketchy bunch, in Nels's private judgment, men who joked too hard, who watched too closely, who seemed like they were always calculating what could be taken. And now, on this March evening, it was Nels' turn to stand watch. Standing watch was its own kind of loneliness. You stayed awake while others slept, patrolled the vessel, listened for anything wrong. It was meant to keep the crew safe even when they were vulnerable. Nels wasn't thrilled about staying up all night, but he was relieved too, in the way a man can be relieved by an unpleasant duty if the alternative is worse. He would rather be awake and miserable than asleep and exposed. He stood at the railing, eyes on the horizon, letting the cold air bite through his clothing. He tried to hold on to the normal thoughts sailors use to fill long watches. The rhythm of waves, the ache in the knees, the way the ship's lights halo against the dark. Suddenly, another sailor came up behind him. Nels heard the steps, felt the presence, and then the man slapped him on the back as if they were old friends. "Hey," the man said, grinning, voice bright with mockery, meant to be harmless. "How you enjoying your sunset cruise tonight?" Nels turned and saw another crew member, one of the new ones, pulling his leg. Nels tried to play along. He attempted a smile, tried to let a small laugh live in his throat. But it didn't quite work, because the sun was nearly gone now, and Nels's gaze kept sliding back to that dark edge of the world, as if his eyes had become magnets for bad news. For the next couple of hours, Nels and the other sailors stood by the railing in the cold night air and talked. Normal things, California, work, what they'd do when they reached shore, what kind of food they missed, what kind of money they hoped to make. Small talk, the thin, precious layer that keeps men from looking too long into the void. For a while, it helped. Nels felt the anxiety loosen, just a little. He found himself almost laughing at something the other man said. He even caught himself thinking, in the dangerous way hopeful thoughts arrive, maybe nothing will happen. Maybe the ship has finally... And then the air changed. It came across the deck like a warm, dry breath. Remember, it had been cold all night. The cold had a presence. It had weight. It had been there long enough for the men to accept it as the night's companion. So when warmth appeared, it stood out like a handprint on glass. Not humid warmth. Not the soft breath of a passing current. Dry warmth, like land heat. Like wind that has crossed sand. The second Nels felt it touch his skin, his stomach dropped. He knew his worst fears were about to be realized. And fear did something strange to him. It didn't make him run, didn't make him shout warnings. It locked him. He froze so completely he couldn't even turn to tell his partner what was happening. The other sailor was oblivious. He'd never been on the Parrier before. He didn't know the secret. He just kept talking, blabbering away, unaware that the air itself had become a signal. Down below, in the ship where the crew was sleeping, a loud, guttural scream rose, so sudden and so violent it sounded like a man being tortured. It tore through the metal corridors and burst out of the stairwell like an animal. Right away, the man beside Nels stopped talking. His grin died. He stiffened, listening. "Did you hear that?" he said, already shifting his weight toward the stairs. Nels still couldn't move. He stood on the deck like a statue, warmth on his skin, cold on his breath, eyes fixed forward as if looking away might make it worse. The other sailor grabbed his arm. "Nels, what's going on? We gotta go down there." Then another scream came, and another. More voices rising from below decks, multiplying into a chorus. That broke something in Nels. It snapped him out of the paralysis. "All right," he managed, voice scraped thin. "Come on." They went bombing down the steps into the berth area. The ship narrowed around them, corridors tight, air stale and heavy with sleeping bodies. They reached the first compartment where the screams were coming from and pushed inside. And Nels saw 2 crew members sitting on one of the bunks, completely rigid, bodies locked as if their muscles had turned to wire. Their mouths were open, screaming as loud as they could, in perfect unison. But their eyes were wrong, staring off into the distance, unfocused, as if their minds had been pulled away from their bodies and left behind. It was like they weren't there anymore. The new sailor with Nels looked from the screaming men to Nels, confusion and fear twisting his face. "What is this?" he demanded. "What's happening to them?" Nels didn't answer him honestly. Not yet. He did the only thing he could think to do, something that felt like action, like control. "Look," Nels said, voice hard, "we can quarantine them. Help me move them." The other man didn't understand, but he reacted to the command, the urgency. Together they grabbed the 2 rigid men. They were stiff the whole time. Their bodies didn't sag or resist like normal bodies. They stayed locked, screaming without pause as if the scream itself was the only thing keeping them upright. Nels and the sailor dragged them out of the room, down the hall, and shoved them into the hold. Essentially, a little jail cell aboard a ship used for sailors who misbehaved. A place with a door you could lock. Nels slammed the door and turned the key. He thought, just maybe, if the affected men were quarantined, it wouldn't spread. He thought he might have been clever. The moment the lock clicked, the entire ship erupted. Screams exploded from every direction, not just one compartment, everywhere. The crew, minus Nels and his partner, began screaming like mad. It became chaos in seconds. Men spilled into the hallway, faces contorted, hands grabbing at walls, bodies colliding. They surged upstairs toward the top deck as if something behind them was burning. Nels' partner's eyes were huge. "Nels, what the hell?" Nels tried to tell himself, "Stay calm. It's okay. It's not happening to you yet." And then it did. He felt it as a sudden crushing pressure in his chest, as if someone had reached inside him and squeezed his heart hard enough to bruise it. His breath hitched, his vision narrowed. Something rose inside him, pressure building, demanding release. Without trying, without even wanting to, Nels screamed. It was the loudest scream he had ever heard come out of his own body. It didn't feel like his voice. It felt like a sound being forced through him. He couldn't stop it. Seconds later, his partner began screaming too. Together, helpless, they were swept into the stampede of screaming crew members running up to the top deck. The night air hit them as they burst outside, but it didn't clear anything. The deck was a moving nightmare. Men running, men grabbing each other, men slamming into railings, eyes wild, mouths open, screams tearing into the black. Nels was still screaming. He couldn't stop. He tried to look around, tried to take stock of what he was seeing, because the mind will cling to observation when it has lost control of everything else. Sailors clawed at their faces as if trying to rip away the scream. Others held their throats, choking themselves, trying to force silence. Some ran into walls, bouncing like insects trapped in a lantern. Some grabbed and fought, punches thrown at whoever was nearest. Absolute chaos. And then Nels noticed one sailor in particular. A young man, one of the sketchy recruits from Hong Kong, someone Nels didn't know well. The young man stopped screaming. The sudden absence of sound around him was sharper than any noise. A calm settled over his face, too calm, unnatural. He dropped down on all fours in the middle of the deck, like an animal. Nels knew in his conscious mind what would happen next. He wanted to stop it. But just as he couldn't stop his own screaming, he couldn't stop what was happening to the young man. The sailor began moving across the deck on hands and feet, faster and faster, galloping like something wild. His body found a speed that didn't look human. He was headed straight for the railing. Nels watched, horror rising through him like bile, powerless, and the young man leapt clear over the side, a single splash into the black water below. The instant his body hit the sea, it was like every man on the ship broke out of a trance. The screaming stopped. Not slowly, not fading, stopped. The deck went eerily quiet, so quiet the creak of the ship sounded loud. Men blinked, swayed, looked around in confusion, as if they'd been dropped into their own bodies without memory of how they'd gotten there. One by one, they turned to each other, mouths opening to ask the same question, without knowing how to phrase it. Then a tense silence broke when someone who'd seen the leap yelled, "Man overboard!" That became the anchor, the one thing they could focus on that made sense. Rowboats were lowered. Men paddled around for nearly an hour, shouting into the dark, turning the ship around again and again. They never found him. He didn't make a single noise. No cry. No splash after the first. Nothing. It was like he vanished into the night. Eventually, the search was called off. The sailor was declared dead. The exhausted men climbed back aboard and stood on the deck, staring at the ocean as if it had taken more than a body. Nels found the captain. Captain Gavinsky stood rigid near the rail, face pale, eyes fixed on the water. When he looked at Nels, there was no surprise in his gaze, only grim recognition. They nodded to each other. They both knew what came next. They would have to tell the crew. They would have to share the ship's dark secret. Nels and Captain Gavinsky gathered the men, those who could stand without shaking, and they told them what they should have told them before Hong Kong, before signatures, before departure. They told them that what happened tonight had happened before, that it had a pattern, that it returned. The crew was horrified, but not exactly surprised, because they'd just lived through it. What they wanted, more than explanations, was a promise. They wanted to believe tonight had been the only night. The ship refused to give them that mercy. The following night, the same thing happened. A warmth, screams, madness, stampede to the deck. Then silence after one man died. The next night, the same. And the next. 4 nights in a row, the ship did it again and again, as if repeating a lesson no one could learn without paying in bodies. By the 4th night, Captain Gavinsky could not take it anymore. When the first scream echoed through the hull, he made a decision that was less dramatic than it sounds in retelling. No speech, no warning. Just a man reaching the end of endurance. He grabbed a pistol, pressed it to his head, and fired. The ship kept moving. In early April, the Parrier finally reached San Francisco, California, where the crew was supposed to offload the hemp and some of the machinery. With the captain gone, command fell to another sailor, Padan, according to the account, because someone had to give orders, even if the men no longer believed in orders. By then, the crew was close to mutiny. They didn't want to be on the ship anymore. They didn't care who was in charge. And once the Parrier got within sight of land, 9 sailors stole one of the rowboats, lowered it, and paddled away as fast as they could. They didn't even ask to be paid. They just wanted distance. Nels and the few remaining crew members docked in San Francisco, unloaded the hemp, and then, because the machinery still had to be delivered, got back aboard and sailed south to Santa Monica, California. It wasn't a far distance. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a routine coastal run. On the morning they were supposed to dock in Santa Monica, at around 2 a.m., the crew's cook leapt overboard to his death. By that point, the remaining men barely reacted. Not because they were heartless, because repeated terror changes what the nervous system can afford to feel. When dread becomes the weather, shock stops working. You conserve yourself in other ways. You watch, you swallow, you keep moving. The Parrier docked. The machinery was offloaded. And when the last of the cargo was gone, Nels and the rest simply left. They abandoned the ship there, at the dock in Santa Monica, as if leaving a body in a street and walking away because you cannot carry it anymore. The ship sat, empty. A Russian steamer, quiet at last, but not in a peaceful way, quiet in the way a room is quiet after a scream. It might have rotted there unnoticed, just another piece of harbor clutter, if not for a reporter from the Chicago Tribune who caught wind of it. A ship, abandoned, men refusing to go near it, whispers that didn't sound like the usual gossip. He decided to dig into it, and in April of 1907, he published the story that began with March's watch on the bow. The warm breeze, the screams, the leap, the silence, the modern nightmare on modern seas. Only after he'd walked the reader through what happened in 1907 did he reveal what Nels and Captain Gavinsky had known all along. Here was the Parrier's dark secret. 3.5 years earlier, on a night in the fall of 1903, the Parrier docked in what was then called Bombay, now Mumbai, India. Some of the crew wanted a night ashore. A few sailors and an officer took a rowboat, lowered it, and paddled toward the lights of the city. According to the account, they had a great time. They drank. They wandered. They did what sailors do when they're briefly allowed to be ordinary men. Then something happened that bent the night. The story claims the officer killed a man on land. No one later could pin down why. The reporter couldn't figure it out. The account leaves it as rumor, an ugly, sharp rumor that clings because it lacks details. It doesn't say what weapon, what words, what exact location. Only that an officer killed someone, and afterward he came back to the ship and bragged about it, joking as if a life was a small thing to toss away. We don't know, even within the story, whether that killing truly happened. We don't know if it was the spark. But what comes next is presented as the beginning of everything. Shortly after the ship left Bombay, it was out at sea in cold air, when a warm, dry breeze wafted across the deck. Seconds later, screams rang out from inside as the crew began going totally crazy. That was the first appearance of what the sailors would later call the ship's dark secret. They called it the Thing. No one saw it. No one heard it. No one could describe a shape or a face. The only thing that arrived before the madness was that warm breeze, out of place, wrong, like a breath that didn't belong to the world. And then pandemonium, until one man died. Again and again, the pattern repeated. The Thing would take the ship, and the crew would scream and fight and run as if chased by something invisible. Usually one sailor would go quiet, calm, and then die, most often by leaping into the sea. Over the next few years, more crews joined the Parrier and went out to sea, and the Thing returned over and over. Many men died. By the time the ship reached port, crews would desert wholesale. Nobody wanted to be near it. That was why Nels Nelson and Captain Gavinsky were the longest-serving men on board, because they were the only ones willing to return after every desertion, to stay step back onto the same deck and pretend they could outrun a pattern. All told, the account attributes 23 deaths to the thing, most of them sailors who, after screaming like maniacs, suddenly went quiet and leapt over the railing to drown. Others were captains who ended their own lives after the ship was abandoned, unable to bear another night. And after the Parrier was left to rot in Santa Monica, the story concludes with uncertainty. It's unclear what happened to her, only that she never sailed commercially again. That's where the printed account ends. And here is the tangible resolution, the part you can point to without arguing. A newspaper in 1907 presented a modern ghost ship narrative as a factual report, anchoring it to name men, name ports, a Californian coastline, a specific kind of terror that announced itself as warmth on a cold deck. But there's one residue the story leaves behind, one thread it does not tie off, and maybe cannot. Because the thing that makes the tale so sleep-compatible, so quietly poisonous, isn't the screaming or the deaths, it's the signal, a warm, dry breath where it shouldn't be. After you've lived with that idea for a few minutes, you start noticing how often air changes without warning, how a hallway can suddenly feel warmer, how a room can exhale when no one is there, how a draft can touch the back of your neck with something that feels almost intentional. And the mind, especially a sailor's mind, trained to respect patterns, does what it always does when it can't see the cause. It names the effect. It calls it a thing. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.